Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Windows on the World. Now, our guest tonight is Jerry Marzinsky, a psychiatric practitioner from Tucson, Arizona. Is that right, Jerry?
That's right.
Yeah. Can you hear me, Jerry?
Well, I just lost you. I saw your mouth move, but I didn't see the video.
Yeah, okay. All right. Yeah. Well, Jerry's had over 35 years of experience working. Okay. All right.
Yeah, I lost your sound.
Well, I'll see how it actually goes. But yeah, Jerry's been a psychiatric practitioner for 35 years. He's now retired and... Okay. Well, let's just see how it goes. Okay. So yeah, we're just having a few connection issues here because I'm in the middle of the countryside, at a secret location. And yeah, our guest tonight, Jerry Marzinsky, has actually been a psychiatric practitioner for 35 years. I've done several interviews with Jerry, and we've got into this incredibly interesting subject as to what is going on with paranoid schizophrenia, and are demons real? Does possession really happen? Now, if we go back to even the ancient Babylonians, they believed there was three types of entities, that there were ghosts, which most people know about, there were those who were possessed by entities, and there were demons. So this goes back a very long way. It's something I've studied, and when I first heard about what Jerry was doing, I was fascinated because I'd never heard anybody talking about this before, and Jerry explained it in such a way that it made absolute sense to me, in that in certain cases of paranoid schizophrenia, people actually do become demonically possessed. Now, this is against all the rules of the profession. The profession of psychiatry states that these are hallucinations and that they are absolutely random and that they're not voices which have any cognitive ability. But Jerry found out that this wasn't the case, and he started looking into it, and through his vast experience of dealing with patients, both in secure mental institutions, which were also in prisons. So he had dealings with people.
Whoop, just lost you.
It's okay, Jerry, I'm back. I think we are having a few connection issues here.
Well, usually with these kind of
I did an introduction
broadcasts anyway. Usually with this topic anyway, I'm used to it. I mean, something always goes electronically wrong, but we were having problems earlier anyway, so I think we could expect a double issue of this stuff.
Well,
can you hear me?
When we tried to do this, and we were... Yes, I can hear you fine. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, I can hear you. Your picture's slow, but...
Yeah. Okay. Well, I remember last time we did this, and we had terrible trouble getting on air, and we all felt really terrible before we went on. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's always with this topic.
Okay.
Something goes wrong electronically every time.
Yeah. So I hope people will kind of persevere with this. If we have too many problems, then I will actually get Jerry on again. But we just thought we'd go for it and see what happens. So I hope you heard the interview, the first bit, and maybe the interviews which are on windowsontheworld.net. If you go to windowsontheworld.net, you'll find two interviews with Jerry Marzinsky, and they're a great background into what we're going to be talking about tonight. So, Jerry, I think you should probably introduce yourself very briefly, and then we'll get on to this book that you've written with Sherry Swiney.
Okay. Like Mark says, I'm a psychiatric practitioner. I've been a licensed psychotherapist in Arizona for decades. And I've worked... I spent 7 years working in the biggest psychiatric institution on the planet. Don't know if you got me. I just lost Mark. And from there went to work in emergency rooms, and then got a job in the state prison, working in the psychology department, where I was able to study schizophrenics in a manner that I was not allowed to in the state hospital. I'm not sure if we still got Mark here because I lost his image, but so at the state hospital, they didn't want you doing anything that would upset psychotics, because you never knew what they were going to do. And security wasn't that great. They were always understaffed. At the state prison, it was a different story. The noise level there was so high that prisoners complaining about somebody from psych asking them too many questions about the voices, where it didn't even reach the ambient noise level. I've lost Mark. I don't know if I still have him here. All I see is myself. So it's.
I'm still here, Jerry. I'm
Okay.
still here. I've let you have center stage, because I think it's better if my camera is switched off when you're speaking. Okay.
Okay.
So I haven't gone. I'm listening.
All right. You jump back in again when you want to go somewhere else. Okay. So I noticed that whatever these voices were that these people were hearing had an effect on their behavior, and it wasn't a good effect. They were constantly telling patients at the state hospital to kill themselves, to hurt others, to act out, to not go to classes, to not take their medications. So the content was consistently negative. And here's psychiatry insisting, now this is without any research whatsoever, none, zero. They just, out of their infinite arrogance, go, the voices are hallucinations because we say they are, and we can't hear them, and other people can't hear them, so they are hallucinations. Without talking to these people about them, without doing any kind of study on them, without looking for any kind of pattern, and that's what they're teaching in the academic institutions right now. So I was curious about.
That's really good, Jerry. Yeah, I'm just trying to bring it on to basically the background of psychiatry for people who don't know much about this subject. I think it might be good to actually delve into that, and some of the things you talk about in the book, which is called An Amazing Journey into the Psychotic Mind, which Jerry's written with a lady called Sherry Swiney, who we're going to talk about, and I'm going to do an interview with soon. And I've had Sherry on the show before. So yeah, Jerry, can you go into a little bit of the background of what psychiatry actually believes? Because you gave a very good overview there, and that these people within the profession do not listen to anything that could be construed as what they would think is supernatural. So can you pick up?
Well, not only supernatural, but spiritual. You can trace this back to the time of Hippocrates back in ancient Greece, where he started with finding physical causes for illness. And the modern medical profession has followed that all the way through. And then a fellow named Mayo Kraepelin, he lived from 1856 to 1926, declared that schizophrenia was also a physical illness caused by some physical factor. But all through, ever since the inception of psychiatry and even before, they've not been able to find any physical factor. No brain disorder, no physical anything, no chemical disorder. They keep saying it's a chemical imbalance. They don't even know what the friggin' chemical balance of the brain should be, let alone that the brain has some kind of chemical imbalance. Matter of fact, that's one of the first things I saw when I was working at the state hospital. They say, I kept asking psychiatry, well, what is this? What causes this? And most of them would say it's a chemical imbalance of the brain. But I never saw them give a single blood test or any other kind of test to test what was out of balance in the brain. They had this formulary of major tranquilizer medications that they would give these guys, and if one didn't work, they'd try another. and it would just be like a shotgun approach, one after another, after another, after another, and they'd stop whatever worked best. There was never any kind of measurement to find out what was out of balance by how much, and where it was. I mean, there's a number of neurotransmitters in the brain. I forgot how many exactly, but something like 23. They don't know what the balance of that is. They just make this crap up out of thin air and say, oh yeah, it's a chemical imbalance because we found a correlation between serotonin and depression. And that started off with one of the drug companies. It was Eli Lilly, I believe it was, back in the 70s, where they came out with Prozac, and they knew it was a lie at the time. And they put that out, that it was a chemical imbalance in the brain that caused depression, and that their medication fixes this. And it's been lie after lie after lie. They started off with we pour in millions and millions of dollars in the research on these medications, and we have to make our money back. Antipsychotic drugs were discovered by accident in a dye lab in Europe. Total accident. And it was Roche and I believe it was some of the French chemical companies that actually extracted it, and the Freudians would not let them use it in Europe because they figured, well, this isn't a biological thing. So after trying all these horrible things they've tried for centuries to try to treat schizophrenics, and there were some horrible things they did. They would they found out that they started out in the old days with what they call trepanning. So they'd cut a hole in the patient's head, and they were doing this all the way back as far as ancient Egypt, cutting holes in the head, letting out whatever evil spirits or whatever was supposed to be in there. In some cases, very few it worked because there might have been pressure on the brain. But they started out with in 1790 with straitjackets in France, and those were made by a sofa manufacturer, upholsterer. And they would lock these guys in these straitjackets, and they would flail in those straitjackets until they were exhausted. So basically they were looking for some kind of treatment, but mostly some way to control these people, because they would get violent and out of control. They would attack each other. They would attack staff. And then somebody found out that, hey, if they were sick, if they were nauseous, they didn't cause as much trouble. So they started spinning them in chairs. They strap them into a chair and spin them over and over and over again until they were dizzy and would throw up. And the doctor would be the one who determined how many spins they would get. Then with women, they would give them. They figured the psychosis was due to female hysteria, and they would give them douches with stuff like vinegar and all kinds of crazy stuff. And then they figured warm water would calm people down, because it calmed a lot of people down. So they started off with giving them hot baths. That didn't work real well, so they started giving them cold baths, and then they started giving them frigid baths with ice and holding them in there for hours and hours, up to 8 hours. And then some psychiatric institutions did something called forced standing, where they would string them up with a rope, and they couldn't fully touch the ground, and they would exhaust them that way. So it was a form of both punishment and torture. And then they found out, what was it? It was syphilis. They found that if they injected malaria into a syphilis patient and the temperature soared, it would kill the syphilis germ. So they figured they would try that with schizophrenics. So they started injecting malaria into schizophrenics, hoping the fever would burn out whatever germ was supposed to be in there and cure the patient of schizophrenia. And that didn't work. Either the schizophrenia germ wasn't at home, or there wasn't one, which was much more inconvenient. So that treatment didn't work. And then they found out that after epileptics had seizures, that they weren't as troublesome. They're worn out. So what they started doing was injecting stuff like insulin to force them into a shock. They called it insulin shock therapy. And that was discovered by accident. And they figured, okay, we'll inject all this insulin, we'll put the person into a shock, and then they won't cause as much trouble. And that's true. They didn't cause trouble for a while. Then they moved to electroshock therapy, and I watched one of those while I was in the state hospital, and it was awful. I almost fainted. I mean, it was just they had a little old lady strapped to the table, and they were injecting these huge needles of muscle relaxant into her. They were the size of horse needles. They were just absolutely huge. And I asked the psychiatrist, I said, well, why are they so big? And he said, well, if we didn't inject that much muscle relaxant, that they would snap their bones when they got hit with the electric shock. And they strapped this lady down, and when he hit that shock button, it was just horrifying. I mean, it was just horrifying watching what happened. She just wriggled all over the place. And then when she stopped, she started to turn cyanotic. So she was dead. I mean, she was dying. And here's a psychiatrist talking to a bunch of students like nothing was going on. And I said, hey, she's turning cyanotic. And almost like an afterthought, he went and got the paddles and gave her another shock and brought her back. And it was like, I almost fainted as I was walking out the room. I'd never seen anything like that. And they were giving 3,000 patients a year these shock treatments. And each one, neurology said you could actually measure the amount of brain damage that they were doing with these shocks, even after one shock. And it wasn't for the most part at the state hospital, it wasn't the psychiatrists who were ordering these things. It was the attendants on the ward telling the psychiatrist, hey, Joe Blow here is causing us a lot of trouble. I think he needs another shock treatment. And they were the ones who were ordering these things, and the psychiatrists were carrying them out. So that worked for a while. I mean, after you get your brain shocked and you're stunned, for a few days and you don't cause any trouble, and then the voices came back. The voices would actually leave in many cases for a short while after they ran, I think it was 450 volts or something like that through the patient's mind or brain. They had these big electrodes they put on either side of their head, and they put gel on there. If they didn't put the gel, the electricity would actually burn their flesh. So they moved from there to lobotomy, because the ETC shock would only work for a few days, and then they'd have to give them another one and another one, another one. And so lobotomy is where they got like an ice pick, and they drive it between their eye into the socket, stick it up and scramble their brain. And it would mess up their prefrontal cortex, and they would basically become zombies. They become like vegetables. And I saw one of these guys at the state hospital too. They weren't quite human. So, now they're working with antipsychotic drugs. And they're making $3.7 billion a year selling these drugs that cure absolutely nothing. All they do is suppress psychotic symptoms temporarily. And when they stop taking these drugs, the psychosis comes right back. So what they'll do is these drugs weaken or maybe temporarily stop the voices, but they don't make them disappear. And one of the first things the voices go after are those drugs. And because the side effects are so horrendous, the voices tell these patients, the doctors, the psychiatrist is poisoning you. And try to get them to go off it, because one of the things these voices do is work overtime to upset these patients and get them as upset as possible, and then scream, holler, tell them all kinds of horrible things. And then right after they're done, the energy level of those patients drops to virtually zero. There were some of the prisoners told me that they could actually feel their energy leaving while the voices were screaming at them. So I saw there was a correlation between the appearance of the voices and their energy levels dropping to almost zero. And that was a 1-to-1 correlation. And this is something that psychiatry won't even look at. and it's right in front of their eyes, and they won't even look at it. The other thing is these voices are consistently negative. They're not like hallucinations, which are random and all over the place. Regular hallucinations are positive, negative, neutral. They're all over the place. So what is it that holds these voices that psychiatry considers hallucinations on such a negative trajectory all the time? How come they don't vary like regular hallucinations? Why don't they stray all over the place? They're consistently, constantly negative. That makes no sense. So they won't even listen to these patients when they start talking to them.
This is a really good point, Jerry.
Yeah, and these patients have been trying to tell them,
I
the
think
whole time.
when we first started talking, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, I think there's a bit of a lag on there then. I was just going to go into that first conversation we ever had, and we got into this and some of the experiences I'd had. I'd wanted to speak to you for years because I'd seen an interview, and it was called Demons, Are Demons Real? I think it was called. And it was the most fascinating thing I think I'd ever heard, when you were relating what was happening to these people and the consistent negativity of the voices, the energy drain, the actual possession of people, because I've seen this before. And then when we actually did get to speak to each other, we talked for hours about it. And I've had these experiences. I know these things to be real, these entities. I've had them actually attack me. And this is an area which I find absolutely fascinating. And over the years, I've done a lot of research into it. And what I wanted to get onto next really was this kind of breakthrough that you had when you found out that these voices were not just random hallucinations, because that's a big revelation. So how did you get to realize that these voices were not just random?
Well, in talking to these people and asking them, while I was in the, I would constantly be asking patients while I worked in the state hospital about their voices, and they consistently got upset about that, and I never could figure that out. And I got into trouble a couple of times with psychiatry. I got pulled up in their office and said, "Don't be asking these people about their hallucinations, because all you're doing is reinforcing them and making them worse." Now, I didn't see that at all. They did get upset when I asked about them. They didn't like talking about them, but that's given. There is no positive benefit to these patients talking about their voices, because all it does is cause them trouble and scares people off. They get drugged into before a psychiatrist. They tell psychiatrists, "Hey, I'm hearing these voices. They're telling me to kill myself. They're telling me to kill my family members. They're telling me to cut myself." And next thing you know, the psychiatrist says, "Okay, they're hallucinations. You're mentally ill. Your brain is broken. You got a chemical imbalance. The only thing you can do is take these toxic antipsychotic meds to calm them down, and that's the only treatment there is. And we'll prescribe them for you. And they cost a horrendous amount of money. Plus, you have to pay for the consult with psychiatry. It's a huge scam." You go 60 miles south of here into Mexico, and you can buy these drugs over the counter. You might want to see a psychiatrist once. He prescribes them for you. You run out. You just go to the drugstore and you buy them. You don't have to go in for another appointment so the psychiatrist can prescribe them again, like I think they do in Europe and here in the U.S. It's this constant scam. And these are not abusable drugs. Nobody in their right mind would want to take these things. They gork you out. They have awful side effects. They're not abusable drugs, but yet they demand that they be the only ones in control of them, and they're making a fortune doing that. It's what happened there? I got a complete black screen.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to really get onto.
Okay, you're back.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
that was an interesting
so
little interlude.
I just drop myself out every now and again. So I think.
Okay. The other thing is
I think it's going quite well. I mean, the exposition is great.
The other thing I saw from early on was that these voices got upset when the patients tried to read the Bible or read any kind of spiritual material. And why would that happen with a hallucination? Why would a hallucination get upset if somebody tried to read the Bible? Why would they get upset if they tried to go to church? That made no sense whatsoever. And most of what they were telling these people were lies. And psychiatry I remember one patient where I was in the office with a psychiatrist when he was talking to one of these patients, and he said, just ignore them. And I knew that didn't work from, trying it myself, telling the patient, well, just ignore them. What happens when you ignore them is they get louder. They will not be ignored. And what kind of hallucination would do that? And the other thing I noticed in the state hospital was the psychiatrists were always getting attacked by these patients. And no other doctor or nurse or psychologist was being attacked at the rate that these psychiatrists were at the hospital. And I thought that quite odd, and I wasn't quite sure why that was. I was thinking, what are these guys doing in 15 or 20 minutes that are pissing these guys off so bad that they're getting attacked at such a horrendous rate? So I looked into that a little bit. And in the Journal of Clinical Psychiatry in 1980, they had a study of assaults upon psychiatrists and compared that to the rate of other doctors and other staff. So over all jobs, they studied 120,000 assaults from 1987 to 1992 over 5 years, and reported that for all jobs, the attack rate was 12.6 per 1,000. The assault rate for other doctors other than psychiatrists was 16.2 per 1,000. The assault rate for custody staff, these are attendants and hospital staff that are around psychotic patients 24 hours a day, 3 shifts. Their attack rate was 69 per 1,000. That's 24 hours a day they're around these guys. Now for psychiatrists, for the little bit of time they were spending, and for the most part, a psychiatrist would spend 15 or 20 minutes with each patient at the state hospital because they had caseloads of like 700. For a little bit of time they were spending, the Journal of American Medical Association reported the assault rate upon psychiatrists is 65 per 1,000, or 5.9 times higher than that of the general population, and virtually equivalent to the assault rate of the custody staff who were spending 24 hours a day around them. So it's like, okay, what's happening there? And at the time, I didn't know what it was. Subsequently, I found it out that those medications are a threat to the voices, and the voices were telling these patients to attack psychiatrists, and they were telling the psychiatrists that the psychiatrist was poisoning them and telling them to attack the psychiatrist. I found that out after questioning a number of them. Another very interesting aspect is the suicide rate of psychiatrists. The suicide rate for schizophrenics, which is one of the leading causes of death for that population, 4 out of 10 will attempt to kill themselves. And according to the National Institute of Mental Health, an estimated 4.9% of people with schizophrenia will actually die by suicide. And you kind of look at that as a measure of the stability of that population. And anybody who looks at that is going, well, that's not a very stable population. Then you look at the suicide rate of psychiatrists who are running our mental health systems at the present time. These guys are in charge of our mental health systems. The suicide rate for them, according to the Journal of the American Medical Association, is 65 for I think it was, the general population is 11 for 100,000. For let me see, it was 65 per 100, or for 100,000, or 5.9 times that of the general population. So it's equal to that of schizophrenics. So both are five or almost 6 times that of the general population for schizophrenics and psychiatrists.
Yeah, I'd just like you to get on now, Jerry, to the voices and really what they are. In other words, these people are becoming possessed by something. These voices are actually entities of something. And I wanted to really get on to when you started to find this out and put it together.
Well, I suspected it for years and years, but I denied it. I mean, I first of all, I believed that they were hallucinations until that didn't make any sense. The more I questioned these guys, the more I asked them what they were and how they operated, it made less and less sense. Then I found that they reacted consistently negatively to all kinds of religious and spiritual material. Why would a hallucination do that? It makes no sense. They were constantly negative. Hallucinations aren't constantly negative. They're all over the place. These things were always causing trouble, telling these patients to kill themselves, to attack other people, not to take their medications. And then I started looking for ways to interfere with them. And what one patient told me, though, this was while I was working in the psych department in the prison, they said that when he repeated the 23rd Psalm, he said his voices reacted like worms thrown onto a hot frying pan. And I went, that's interesting. So when I heard something like that, I mean, there was no lack of schizophrenics in the state prison because they closed down all the state hospitals here in the U.S. And now they throw them all in prison. So instead of trying to help them, they just punish them. And that all that does is make these people worse. They come out in worse shape, harder, angrier, more upset than they ever went in. And then they're released back on society again. And the recidivism rate is something like 75%. It's astronomical. So
really the voices drive them into total negativity. I've heard many of your stories, and this is what I find absolutely fascinating about it, in the respect that the voices have an actual plan of action. They appear to have a plan of action, but they're actually getting their energy from the trauma of the person that they're invading. Is that what you found?
That's pretty close to true. What they do is they will insert thoughts into the patient's mind that will upset them. And what's even more interesting is I've had a large number of them tell me that they have access to their entire memory. So they can go in there and they can pull up every rotten memory that patient ever had and take it and rub it in their face and tell them what a jerk and how stupid they were, and over and over and over and over again. Now, this isn't just happening to schizophrenics. This happens to all of us, and they are getting all of us. Virtually every negative thought you have about yourself or anybody else is inserted into your thought stream by these things. So the question is, where do thoughts come from? Psychiatry and psychology.
This is such a good point, Jerry. Yeah, this is such a good point. Where do these thoughts come from? I think if you're consciously aware of every moment, then I don't think these negative thoughts actually get in. If you're actually aware of yourself and aware of having an awareness, it's almost like a meditational thing. It's quite hard to explain, but I've found that a lot of it is to do with mood as well. But what we're talking about with schizophrenic patients, paranoid schizophrenic patients, the ones you've studied, is that this is on an even more intense level. In other words, they get invaded by these very powerful entities. So in other words, I don't think these lower level entities are that powerful, but they have to be kind of invited in. And this is what I wanted to get onto. The invitation can be through opening up the psyche with drugs or alcohol. And this is something we've talked about. I'd like to get onto that at some point, but just finish off your point that you were making there.
Well, the point I was making is they don't just hit schizophrenics. They hit them the worst, but they hit us all. So virtually all of you out there have been walking down the sidewalk one day, and then all of a sudden out of nowhere, just absolutely nowhere, this horrible thought just invades your mind. It's something that you would never think of on your own. It's something that you would never do or act on. And it's so horrendous, it just shocks you. It's like, where did that come from? Yeah,
Yeah, I think everyone's had those thoughts, but it's the kind of difference between having those thoughts and then acting on them, which is meant to be the sign of a person being in some kind of sanity. In other words, when people get so overtaken by these voices and they start acting on them, then it becomes very dangerous. And then we're talking about the experiences of these people that you dealt with, paranoid schizophrenics, and the extremity of what happened to them and the degradation that they'd go through. Now, a point I think that's really interesting is about the drugs and the paranoid schizophrenics. You said when we first did the interview, this paranoid schizophrenics would stop taking their drugs, but they would get into a much worse state than could be possibly imagined. So can you just tell us a bit about that?
Well, that was one thing I was wondering when I was back at the working in the state hospital, is virtually all of them would eventually stop taking their drugs. So that just boggled my mind. It's like, I knew the side effects were awful for those drugs, but psychosis was very much worse, very much worse. So I started experimenting with that. Every schizophrenic on my caseload who went off his drugs, I'd pull them into the office, because if they went off 3 times, they would throw them out of the vocational program that they were being sponsored in, because they figured if they can't stay on those drugs, they can't stay sane. So I was wondering, why would they want to quit their drugs and go insane? I mean, it was like they were voluntarily going insane. And this is before I knew much about the voices telling them this kind of stuff. I mean, that came years later. So I'd pull them in my office, and I had 2 sheets of paper. I gave them a blank one, and I said, well, at first I'd ask them straight up, why'd you go off your meds? And the consistent answer was, we hate the side effects. I mean, that's almost every single one of them said the side effects are awful. I don't want to take these things. They're terrible. And then you ask them, well, is psychosis worse or better? And the consistent answer is, it's much worse. So they tell me that, and then I go, well, then why did you quit taking your medicines? And their answer was consistently, I don't know. So I'm like, well, maybe they don't understand the question. So from that point on, when they came in, I'd give them a blank sheet of paper, and I'd say, write down every side effect that you've experienced from your medications before you quit, because they didn't all experience the same side effects. So they'd write down 5 or 6 of them, and then I'd give them 2 sheets of paper with all the symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia. All the stuff, the hallucinations and seeing monsters and shadow people and wanting to kill themselves, and I mean, all this horrible stuff. And I'd hand that to them, and I said, check off every single one of these symptoms that you've experienced while you were off your meds. And they'd check them off, and both sheets would be full of check marks. And then I'd hand them both back to them, and I said, well, which is worst? The side effects or all these things you checked off while you were psychotic, including suicide attempts? And they would say, well, the psychosis is worse. And then I'd go, well, then why did you stop taking your meds? This went on for years. This went on for absolute years. It's 3, 4, 5 years. I was asking the same question, and I was feeling like a lunatic myself, asking the same question and expecting a different answer. And their consistent answer to that question was, I don't know. And I'd ask them, well, if you don't know, who does? Well, I don't know. So it was toward the end of my 7 years at the state hospital when one gal who was doing pretty good in classes while she was on her meds, she stopped taking them for a 3rd time. They were about to throw her out of the program. And her mother calls me from South Georgia and says, please don't do that. I can't handle her here at home. I can't deal with this. You got to keep her in the program. She's got to have a skill, and she's got to be on meds. She asked, can I come up and talk to you two together? So I said, okay, come on up this Friday. And she drove up, and both of us were in my office asking this gal, why did you go off your meds? And she was hemming and hawing. She wouldn't say. And then finally, her mother virtually begged her, and she said, "Well, I'll tell you, but you won't believe me." And she said, "The voices told me that I was being poisoned and to go off the meds, and that the psychiatrist was trying to poison me." And that's like one of the first times I've heard that. So I started asking other patients whether that was the case with them also. And it turned out that in a lot of cases it was, and that their attention was being directed from everything else to the side effects of those medications until they quit. So it was like something was in there steering their attention away from everything else they were doing in life and staring at those side effects the medications had. So it was clear as that emerged that these things were behind that. They didn't want them on medications. I'd already seen that these guys were attacking the psychiatrist, and at that point it clicked. If the voices are telling them the psychiatrist is poisoning them, the next step is to attack the psychiatrist, and their attack rate, as you've seen from the statistics, is astronomical. By their patients, the patients, psychiatric patients attack their doctor more than any other patient attacks their doctor. These things do have an agenda, and I saw clearly that their energy level would drop to nothing while they were being attacked, and I couldn't ask them a whole lot about this because I got in trouble for asking questions at the state hospital. The psychiatrist said, "These are hallucinations, you're just making them worse." But when I got to the state prison, there was so much noise there that, somebody from psych asking a psychotic inmate about his voices wouldn't even reach it didn't even reach the ambient noise level. So I always surrounded myself with a group of maybe 10 or 15 schizophrenics who were willing to tell me in real time what their voices were telling them as we were talking to each other. And, it came on over and over again. I would ask them questions, and periodically the voices in different patients, this is different ones that didn't know each other, would come up and go, "Don't tell him anything more. He already knows too much." And I'm like, a hallucination is telling you that? It's like, what is going on here? And then it happened again, and then it happened again. And I'm like, what is it they don't want me to know? And so I started experimenting with ways to interfere with them, and started out with the 23rd Psalm because they hated that. So one thing that I consistently used while investigating was anything that upset them. Now, I could get away with that in the prison, but I couldn't do it in the state hospital. Anything that upset the voices, I would tell the patient to throw more of that at them. So the 23rd Psalm would infuriate them. And I'm kind of going, why would a hallucination be infuriated by the 23rd Psalm? But it happened over and over and over again with scores of different patients. So I started passing out copies of the 23rd Psalm. And I said, every time you start hearing the voices, just start repeating the 23rd Psalm. And I found out that either they would lose those or they would forget to recite it. But somehow those 23rd Psalms were disappearing by the time that particular patient got back in for their monthly checkup. They had lost the 23rd Psalm, or they had completely forgotten to repeat it. So
now, Jerry, is that because their lives are generally chaotic because of the constant interruption, or do you think that this was just a coordinated thing because whenever they are approached by anything which they see as the light, they tend to either get very angry or they create a reaction? Is that why?
Well, yeah, they will drive people away from. Matter of fact, I started questioning the schizophrenics in the state hospital about their church attendance and reading the Bible. And I remember one telling me, this is when I found out that there was such a reaction. What I first spotted was that when the chaplain held a ice cream social down in the rehab center where we were, the screen just went blank again. I don't know if I'm still on or not.
Yeah, you're still on, Jerry. Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. That all the schizophrenics on my caseload would stay on the dingy ward and wouldn't go down there for the ice cream and cake social, and ice cream and cake were hard to come by at the state hospital. So I started asking them questions. Time after time, I noticed this, and started asking, well, hey, why don't you go down with the others and get some cake and ice cream? I don't like preachers. That's a bunch of crap, and God doesn't exist, and I don't want anything to do with that. So they were down on anything religious to start with. And then I had one tell me that when they were reading the Bible, the voices came up and said, why are you reading that crap? Jesus couldn't even save himself. What makes you think he's going to save you? I mean, their voices are telling them this. Or they would tend to be distracted away from reading stuff like that or going to church, and distracted into doing something else. So I found that very interesting. So these things were actually directing their attention. And where you give your attention, you give energy. That's where your energy goes. And these voices were directing their attention in negative, nasty ways that would get them in trouble. And then their energy levels would drop to zero, and that was time after time after time after time. And I would ask them, did you notice that after you're attacked by these voices, that your energy level drops? And every single one would say, well, yeah, I noticed that. And so where do you think your energy goes? And they would go, I don't know. And I'd say, well, if you were sitting near a campfire and you stuck your hand in that fire and got burned, and you did that 100 times, and every time you got burned, what was burning you? And they had no trouble saying it was the fire. But you ask them, well, okay, the voices have come thousands of times in your life, and every time they've come, your energy was drained. Where do you think your energy was going? And they would go, 98% of them would say, I don't know. And then if you try to point that out, the voices would get very animated. They get very, very angry, and they would tell the patient to either attack me or leave the office. They did not want them to have that information. And I found that very interesting. So it became how to get that information across to them. Because if you have a parasite on you, if you had a big leech on you, and you weren't aware it was there, you wouldn't do anything about it. Once you become aware that something is sucking your life energy, then you get upset. And then there's resistance. And the voices didn't want anybody to realize that they were voices, that they existed, that they were separate entities. And this crap that the psychiatry is putting out, that they're meaningless hallucinations due to a chemical brain imbalance, is one of the worst dangerous things that they could do. It's like having a room full of rattlesnakes and ignoring them. Like, oh yeah, go ahead in this room, and you hear the rattles rattling, and you're being told, oh no, that's a hallucination, until you get bit. And the suicide rate on these guys is extremely high. So
yeah, I mean, the turning point of this for you, I want to get to that in a bit, but also the realization that what was going on inside the heads of these people, or in certain cases, could actually manifest itself outside the person. That was something I found fascinating in that previous interview we did. You had that example of the inmate who was in his cell who didn't want to come out. Could you just tell everyone about that?
Yeah, that was another thing I saw while working in the prison. Is these guys, these psychotic guys, would become supernaturally, what do you call it, strength. I mean, they just got supernatural strength. I mean, I watched a little 100-pound schizophrenic bounce 3 good-sized guards around the inside of a cell like they were popcorn. But the most dramatic one, there were several instances like that. The most dramatic one was one in one of the maximum security cell blocks in Florence, where the guards were trying to move this, like 200-pound muscular psychotic inmate out of his cell to another cell, and he did not want to go. So they approached his cell. They said, "Okay, cuff up. We're taking you to another cell." And he goes, "Screw you! I'm not going anywhere." And they go, "Cuff up. Get your hands out here. Cuff up." and we're moving you. And he goes, come in and get me. So they went, well, we're going to go get the pepper spray, which is, they have these quart canister cans of pepper spray there. And it's nasty stuff. It's very nasty stuff. I mean, even if you're around it, your eyes start burning, your skin starts burning. So he's sitting there, and they said, come on out, or we're gonna hit you with the pepper spray. So he sits down on his bed, and he gets a towel and puts it up in front of his face, and they just start drenching him with that stuff. And it's very nasty stuff, like 2 quarts of this stuff just all over the inside of his cell. And they were suffering. The guards were suffering from it, from the backlash of that stuff. And they stopped spraying him, and he puts the towel down. They said, okay, now come on out, or you're going to get some more. And he goes, screw you, bunch of sissy asses, come in and get me. And so they got another can, they sprayed it on him. He put the towel up in front of his face again, and he would not come out of there. And at that point, nobody was going to go in there and get him either. The cell was drenched with this pepper spray stuff. So they say, you come on out, or we're going to go get the dogs. So they have these well-trained tack dogs at the prison, and the prisoners were just absolutely horrified of those things, because they would rip them to pieces. Those dogs were, they were like savage once they were turned loose. They just tear them to pieces. So they said, come on out, or we're going to go get the dogs. And he goes, come in and get me, you bunch of sissies. Screw you, get lost. So they went and they got the dog, put him on a leash. No, before they got the dog, they went and got the, these taser things. So they'd shoot like a dart into the prisoner with this very thin wire, and it would, there'd be 50,000 volts of electricity they'd get hit with once they pulled the trigger on that thing. And that was enough to knock out the biggest prisoners. I mean, it would just bring them right down. So they shot him with one, and he just stood there and shivered, didn't move, just stood there and shivered. So they got another one, and they shot that at him. So they had 2 in him now, 50,000 volts each. And while one was discharging, the other one was charging. And they did that, I think, 11 or 13 times before the warden, who finally came down there, said, hey, they're going to get me for cruel and unusual punishment. You need to stop this stuff. And he didn't come out. He wouldn't go down. He didn't even fall down off his feet. He just stood there and shivered. And they couldn't believe it. They just couldn't believe it. They ordered him, now come on out, cuff up, we're going to move you now. So instead of just turning his water off and not feeding him for a while until he got tired, so now the entire cell block is watching this contest from all these blocks for tears up and looking down, and it was like guards against the inmate. It was like their Super Bowl day. They are cheering on the psychotic inmate in there. So the guards couldn't lose this one. They had to show that they were superior, even though what they were doing was really dumb. So they told him, now come on out, or we're going to go get the dogs. So that's the worst of all the options they had. They stopped shocking him, and they went and they got the dog, and they said, okay, come on out, or we're going to sick the dog on you. So same thing, come on and get me, you bunch of candy ass sissies. Screw you. So they slid open the door wide enough for the dog to get in there. The dog leaped at this guy. He was sitting on his bed, and he throws up his arm in front of his face, and the dog clamps onto his wrist and bites right down to the bone. And the inmate pulls the dog up to his face with the dog's head attached to his jaws attached to his wrist. He looks the dog in the eye, and he says, sit. And the dog sits. And then he starts petting the dog. Now, the dog doesn't let go of his arm. I mean, he's bleeding, gushing blood all over the place, but the dog still got him in his jaws, and he starts petting the dog and going, nice puppy, nice puppy. And they're all outside the cell like, what the hell is going on? So they grabbed it. By then, there's like 15, 20 guards out there, and they grabbed the leash that the dog was tied to, and they drag him out because the dog wouldn't let go of his wrist. And they drag him out of the cell and then beat the crap out of him they all ganged up on him. But these guys become supernaturally strong when they're upset. I mean, who knows where that energy goes? There was one devil worshiper that I talked to briefly. Now, this guy was spooky. He was real spooky. And he had more energy than any of the other schizophrenics that I was working with. And I asked him, I said, where do you get your energy? How come you're not drained like the rest of these guys? And he said, they give it to me. I said, who gives it to you? Well, the dark side gives it to me. Well, for what? Well, to get certain jobs done, he said. So apparently they're given that energy from, these dark entities when they're going to use it if they use it for evil. So, that's why you don't want to mess with one of these guys. I mean, I remember one time, this was funny. I was working in the ER, one of the ERs in one of the bigger hospitals, and in comes these two cops with this little old lady who had a spit mask on that was covered with blood, and their uniforms were covered with blood, and their shirts were torn. And here's this lady screaming and punching at them, and they're dragging her into the ER. And it's clear that this little old lady had torn the crap out of them, and so they dropped her off and left. And after she calmed down a little bit, I went up to her. I said, hey, what's going on? What happened? And she said, well, I was just digging through some trash, and they came up there and they started hassling me. And then they ordered me to go away, and they started, threatening me. And I just, they tried to put me in the cop car, and I tore up she tore up the back of the cop car. She was bashed her head against the grate, and she was spitting blood on them all the way to the ER. And basically she was just harmlessly picking trash, and they started messing with her, and she tore them up like a cat. Yeah. So, and they know stuff that most people can't.
The same incident you were talking about. Yeah.
Okay, I missed what you just said. It was blurred.
Yeah, it just froze up there for a minute. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, yeah, that's why I turned the camera off and I've got it like this. So, yeah, you were relaying to me about that external noise as well. That was something that really interested me when you heard these sort of electrical noises going off.
Yeah, let me regress a little bit. When I was still experimenting with these things, I found that when they were strong enough, when they had enough control, they would move from being heard inside the patient's mind to outside, where they were actually talking to these guys from outside of themselves. Now, that really upset them, because at that point they knew that it wasn't their mind. There was something speaking to them from outside. But while I was working in the prison, and I was working with the group I was telling you about, there was one guy who was getting better and better and better. And as we figured out different ways to interfere with the patterns that these voices were running, which kind of reduced their control over these patients in almost all instances, they started coming in and saying the voices are really getting pissed off with you. They're really getting mad at you. And I'm going, a hallucination is getting mad at me? And then one guy who was doing fairly well, he goes, he turns around as he's leaving, and he goes, you know what you're doing is dangerous, don't you? And I'd never thought about it, because I'm thinking, well, whatever these things are, they're stuck in them. They can't come out of them and get me. They're stuck in their heads. And when he said that, I went, well, where'd that come from? So shortly after that, I had one prisoner who was in this group. He comes and he knocks on my door. He didn't have an appointment, and he says, the voices want to talk to you. And I go, they want to talk to me personally? And he says, yeah, they want to talk to you personally. And that never happened before. Usually it would be the patient would tell me what they're saying, and usually it was like, you're a jerk, you're stupid, get lost, this guy doesn't care about what you're saying. I mean, all kinds of stuff like that. And then I'd give some kind of response and say, well, tell your voices to go soak their head in the toilet or something like that. So it was those kind of interchanges, but never did they speak personally. Never did they come through as themselves. So, I was kind of taken back when he showed up at the door and said they want to speak to you personally. And I told him, well, come on in. He sat down and I said, well, what do they have to say? And he looks at me and his voice changes just slightly. He got a little deeper. And these words came out of his mouth as, you have no right to interfere with our way of life. And I'm like, holy cow, that's where my denial system completely collapsed. I could no longer deny that these things were hallucinations or something else. I mean, this was an entity speaking to me, and almost immediately the prisoner said, that wasn't me speaking, that was them talking to you. I didn't say that. And then I said something about, well, look at this, or I was showing him something, or show them this, or tell them, and he said, they can see you. So that's when I realized they were looking through his eyes. They were listening through his ears, and that was like Twilight. It was like do 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 do. It was like Outer Limits time. So I'm like, boom. I mean, after that, I canceled my appointments for the day, and it took me a day or two to get my wits back around me. And I'm like, kind of going, what is going on here? What am I getting into? This is getting stranger and stranger all the time. And I couldn't talk to anybody about this. I couldn't go to my boss and say, hey, the voices are threatening me. John Doe's voices are threatening me or giving me warnings. My wife was terrified even if I mentioned anything about this stuff. So there were times where I thought I was going crazy. It's like, because this is not your normal reality. And I had no cognitive map of what I was entering. It was just a very strange, weird world. And it was like visiting some strange, evil country and not knowing where you were going or having any guides or any kind of map, or you just get in there and you start fumbling around and messing around with things to see what happens. And that was the first one where I was warned. It was a pretty straight warning. You have no right to be doing this, and we don't like it. And then the one that happened shortly after that, and I thought this was with the same fella. I was reading a book by Miguel Ruiz, who's a shaman, and he was talking about entities that took over people's thinking like this, and them also being energy vampires, draining the victim's energy. So I brought that book into the prison and called this guy in. And I asked him, I said, well, I'm going to read you a paragraph and I'd like your opinion on it. And as soon as I hit the part where it started talking about these entities being vampires, stealing the individual's energy, bam, this crackling erupted behind my head. And it was like an arc welder. It sounded just like an electric arc welder, just a crack, 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 crack. And it started moving up the wall on my right-hand side of my office, crack, 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 all the way up the wall and then across the ceiling. And I'm looking at this guy and he's got this strange affect to him. He's just staring at me like a zombie. And I asked him, I said, did you hear this? And he doesn't respond. He's just sitting there staring at me. So I'm thinking he's going to attack. So I push my office chair against the wall, get ready to kick him back. And that crackling keeps going. It goes down the left side of my office, coming right toward me. And I'm like, God damn, what the hell is going on here? And it jumps into this Rubbermaid trash can right next to my left leg. And I look down in there and it is totally empty. There's nothing in there except this crackling sound. And, then it suddenly stops. I mean, it stops as suddenly as it came on. And I look at this guy and he's like a zombie. He slowly gets up and he goes, I gotta leave. And he shuffles out of the office and I'm like going, yeah, get out of here. Go leave. And after that, I checked after he left. Thank God it was such a relief to get him out of there. And I'm like, what happened? What just happened? And I started searching the walls for burn marks to see if there was any electrical burn marks or scorches, or there wasn't anything. There was no evidence that that had ever happened. And I walk out into the hall and I start checking all the other doctors' offices and nurses' offices to see if anybody's there. I was the only one there. The only person there was a female guard up front. And yeah, I just melted down. It was at that point, it was my mind turned to mush. It was like, what just happened? And I was in shock. I canceled all my appointments for the rest of that day, and just kept it light for a long while after that. Because if they could manipulate physical reality like that, no telling what else they could do. And the warnings were getting stronger and stronger and stronger, from, they're getting upset with you, to actually coming out and saying, stop it, you have no right to do this, to causing an electrical arc welder crackling for probably 20 to 30 seconds in my office. It wasn't any brief thing. There was no mistaking it. It was there. And it took me 2 to 3 months to get up the nerve to call that guy back again. And I figured when I did bring him back, he'd be a mess, because if they had that much control, they probably pretty much destroyed him by then. But when he showed up, he looked normal. I mean, his affect was good, his energy level was good. I was expecting him to be a wreck. And after some small talk, I asked him, "Hey, last time you were in my office, did you hear that crackling noise that appeared out of nowhere?" And he goes, "Yeah, I heard it, but I was surprised you did." And I said, "What was that?" And he said, "That was them." And I said, "Who?" He said, "The voices." And I said, "Well, what were they trying to do? What were they doing?" He said, "They were trying to scare you off." And I said, "Well, they did a damn good job of it." And I said, when you got up to leave my office, you looked like a zombie. I said, what were the voices telling you then? And he said, they were telling me to go get a shank and stick it in your belly, which is a homemade prison knife. And I was like, oh, I've been working with this guy for 6 months. He's got much better. He's functioning better than he has in a long time. He would never do anything like that. So I figured, just for a lark, I'd ask him why he didn't do it. So I said, why didn't you do it? He said, I couldn't find one. And I'm like, whoa, what the hell am I getting myself into with this stuff? So it got...
Jerry, this is really fascinating. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. It got
That's
worse
great.
from there.
Yeah, well, carry on. Yeah, that's fine. Just if you want to finish that story off, I just wanted to make sure that everything was okay. And we've got some quite interesting comments in chat as well tonight, which I don't think you can see, but I might read some of them out before we sign off tonight.
Okay,
but
feel free.
If you want, if you want to finish that section off, that's great. And then I wanted to get into the idea that the actual voices have a hierarchy. In other words, that there are higher demonic entities who actually have this kind of pecking order. So that the voices themselves are actually controlled by other entities. That's what I wanted to get on in the next section, but please finish this off. Yeah.
Well, where it went from there was, as I learned more and more about how to disrupt and get rid of these voices, these inmates started to fully recover. No more voices. I mean, they disappeared. And now it took a while, and it took them a lot of work, and it took a lot of consistent work. But the voices completely disappeared. There were no more symptoms. They didn't need the meds any longer. And that's when I got in trouble with administration, when they noticed this. I thought they'd be happy about this, but no, they weren't happy about it. But for a good while, after every single inmate completely got rid of his voices, the day that they got rid of the voices, that night at about 3 to 4 in the morning, between that hour, I got attacked in my bed, and it was like something was crushing me down into the bed. I could feel it. My whole body was being crushed down, and I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified. And that happened several times. And it happened immediately after each one of these prisoners had recovered. Yeah. And we're talking completely recovered. They didn't need any meds. They weren't hearing voices anymore. They'd already started on a positive spiritual path. And and these things were pissed off. They were royally pissed off. So that was terrifying in and of itself. But it, you know, I've like yourself. I'm not one to be bullied, and I don't like things like that attacking me, and it pissed me off. So it's like, okay, you know, I'm going to give you more of the same. So it became a slugfest for a while. And as these guys kept recovering, the chief psychologist put me under investigation for doing some unapproved therapy. So they have that locked up too. You have to. They have no answer to what this schizophrenia is. They have no idea what causes it. They have no idea how to cure it, but they certainly are willing to outlaw any other alternative therapy that has any impact on this disorder at all. And anybody who uses that, including shamans or people like myself, are completely, you know, oh, you're bringing us back to the Stone Age. That's a bunch of crap. So here they are without having done a single study on the voices. They have nothing that cures it. They don't know what causes it, but yet they know everybody who's getting any kind of positive result is full of crap. You know, it's just, what a scam. You know, what a friggin' scam. And all those medications are toxic. They should not be used for long periods of time. The therapies that Sherry and I have come up with, or similar ones, should be, you know, the medications have a place in. Without them, there's a lot of schizophrenics that I would not have been able to reach because they were so upset. But once they're on the medicines, the voices go, the strength of the voices lessens and they become less frequent, and I can reach the person. Otherwise, the voices just blot me out. They just get so loud, they don't allow the guy to listen or hear anything I'm saying. So I'm not saying these medications are not useful. They're very useful, but they should not be used as the main treatment for schizophrenia because it is not a biological disease. Psychiatry cannot conceive of any kind of illness that has no biological cause and no biological cure. It just doesn't exist in their mind. They can't relate to something like that. They think that every disease should have a cure. And you look at this garbage they're putting in their DSM, their Dictionary of Mental Illnesses. Every single one of those darn things are made up. You know, there's no test to prove these existed. There's no lab test to prove these things. There's no proof of it. It's a bunch of psychiatrists get together, 3/4 of which are controlled by the big pharma, and they come up with these illnesses, and then the big drug companies come up with some chemical to treat these things, and instead of people relying on their own coping mechanisms and dealing with life, they're saying rely on these drugs. You know, here they got a drug for everything, and then 6 months later they're being sued on television by class action suits over their toxic drugs. It looks like they're trying to drug all of society. I mean, from these chemtrails they're constantly spraying in the skies, to the psychiatry being given carte blanche to give people medicine for just regular emotional things that happen in the course of life. You know, your girlfriend leaves you, you know, instead of muscling your way through it, oh, go take this drug, go get some Prozac, go get some antidepressant stuff, and you go to your doctor, and then they advertise this stuff on television. Oh, hey, here we got this. Go ask your doctor if he'll prescribe it for you. I mean, it's ridiculous. $3.7 billion a year just on antipsychotic drugs that cure absolutely nothing. What a friggin' scam this is, you know, without having done any research into the voices whatsoever. And they're still saying they're hallucinations. You know, and they won't talk to their patients about it.
Or the Pharmacological Society. And this is where it ties in to just about everything outside psychiatry as well. So it doesn't matter, it's big pharma, they're part of that industry, and the history of psychiatry, we've been into that, the directionlessness of psychiatry just means that they have to keep inventing new illnesses, but they never find a cure. And I think that is the most revealing thing. But yeah, before we finish this section, Jerry, it would be great to go into that idea of the voices having controllers, that there's higher demons who actually tell these people that they have no light in them. And in other words, the voices are answerable to other voices. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I've had two experiences like that, where there was one gal I was working with in the ER where, I've learned how to get rid of these things temporarily so I could reach the patient. And it's only a temporary thing. And unless they carry on and do something to keep these things away, they will come back, but they can be driven out. Now, thoughts are things, and it's not like just schizophrenics are being attacked by these things. We all are. Every negative thought that you have about somebody or somebody else or yourself is being put there by them. And they're kind of two sources. Is one, your memory. I mean, if you're thinking, you're playing a program, you're running a program, and that program is consisting of memories that you've had all your life, and they're just different renditions of those memories, and those memories are in your subconscious. So you're driving down the road and here comes a song on the radio that you heard 10 years ago, and you remember everything you were doing at that time, and all that comes to life right in front of your eye just from this song coming on. So these things have complete access to the memory of these patients and all the rest of us. And that's what Carlos Castaneda said in his writings toward the end of his series. He said they give us their minds. And they can bring up these memories, and they can rub them in your face to generate this negative emotional energy. And you look like, everybody makes a mistake sometime and they start kicking themselves in the butt. Why did I do that? Why did I say that? How come I didn't do this? Now look at the mess I'm in. And it goes on and on and on and on. That doesn't happen in the animal kingdom. You watch a lion chase a gazelle and it narrowly escapes with its life. And then it moves away and the lion disappears and it just goes on with its life. It's not paranoid all the time. I mean, it's watching, but it just goes on with its life. It's not like, constantly paranoid. It's just goes back to the way it was. That's not so with people. I mean, it's over and over and over. We're the only species on the planet that beats ourselves up with that kind of stuff. And it's not us that's doing it. It's these things throwing those thoughts in, and they are generating negative emotion from that stuff, and they take it off. They siphon it off from all of us to different degrees. Now, like what you were saying, if you're running a mantra or you're staying in the present, and you shut down that mental machinery that's constantly playing the memories, then they can't get you. They have to be in control of your memories or your attention. And what they're doing is constantly moving your attention, focusing your attention to negative, nasty things, just like what's happening now with this friggin' coronavirus crap. All the mainstream dark entities are pointing to this and trying to stir up a furor. They're trying to cause a breakdown among everybody. And look what's happening. It's crazy.
Yeah, maybe we should get on to how we can actually interrupt this and get rid of them. I mean, I've done a lot of shows on this in the past, and we've talked about all these kind of aspects of paranormal and demonic possession and psychic attack. And I think that just to kind of sort of finish off this interview, it'd be really good to go into what you talk about in the book, what you've talked about with Sherry. The book is called An Amazing Journey into the Psychotic Mind by Sherry Swiney and Jerry Marzinsky. And Jerry and Sherry have been working together for quite some time. And Sherry has a program which removes the voices. Can you go into that, Jerry?
Well, it doesn't quite remove them. What it does is starves them to death. So
yes,
Sherry and I had been working together for well over 10 years before she told me. I mean, we're working together on prison reform issues before she actually told me that as a young kid, she heard these voices and she struggled with them for years and they almost killed her. And I couldn't believe it because she's one of the most spiritually advanced people that I know of. And so I started hitting her with every question under the sun. And these were questions that nobody could answer unless they had heard these voices. And boom, 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 boom. She came through on every single one. And then we started comparing notes about what we'd learned about them. And I knew they were liars. I mean, they were consummate liars. They lie about everything. Any lie that they can use to generate negative emotional energy, they'll throw at the victim. And they do that with all of us. You know, they can skew your perception and make things look in the worst possible form. So we're comparing notes, and she said, yeah, I noticed that too. I came up with a program for myself. It's called the That's a Lie program. So as I mentioned earlier, every single negative thought that she had about herself or anybody else, she would respond, that's a lie, that's a lie, that's a lie. If they can't get you to believe that lie, they can't hook you. So they're like fishermen. They'll go into your mind, they'll pull out some rotten bit of information and they'll throw it at you and like cast the hook out, see if you'll bite on it. And if you pay attention to it and start dwelling on it, then they start draining you. So yeah, that's their whole deal. They have to turn your emotional state negative before they can take your energy. So they're energy vampires. And schizophrenia is like a virus that invades the mind, where they start taking control of the mind. And I wouldn't say it would be possession. It'd be more like obsession, because there's a battle. You know, the person who was there is constantly battling against these voices, and there's a fight going on. And what's so devastating about psychiatry saying they're hallucinations is that when the patient feels that it's them that's broken, then it removes all responsibility from them doing anything about it and puts it in the hands of psychiatry, who is drugging them with these toxic drugs and destroying their brains. You know, oh no, you can't do anything about it. The only treatment for it is these toxic drugs that we're giving you. And oh, by the way, you got to pay us a fortune for these things. And then you got to come back every month and pay us another fortune for a doctor visit so we can give you another prescription of these expensive toxic drugs. You know, once the patient realizes that those voices are not him, they're not who he is, that these are an outside entity attacking him, that's a major relief, you know, for them. And there's three classes. The ones who understand that these voices are not who they are in much better shape than the ones who believe that their minds are broken, whatever psychiatry is telling them. You know, and then there's the ones that just don't know. You know, they're not sure what they are. They don't know if it's them or something else. And the voices, I mean, I've had dozens and dozens of schizophrenics ask the voices, who are you? What are you? And you know what they say? Guess what they say? Take a guess. You there?
We're you.
Yep, we're you.
Yeah.
We're you.
Yeah.
They don't want the patient to know that they are something separate. You know, because if the patient believes it's them, that their mind is broken and that it's their fault, and you know, society fosters this. You know, people think that their thoughts are who they are, and that's not true. You know, because you can step back and you can watch your thoughts enter your mind. You can watch them come. You can listen to them. You know, who is the one watching? Who's the one listening? You can't be your thoughts.
That was the point I was trying to get to earlier on. Yeah, that was the point I was trying to get to earlier on, I think, because that sort of open state of awareness is actually where these things can't go. And it's usually just when you're outside that awareness of everything, where you slightly drift, something can get in. And that's where you get these really horrifying moments sometimes. And I think everyone gets this, where you get this urge to do something terrible, like you were talking about earlier on. And it's almost like you think, oh, maybe it's just me sort of challenging myself or something like that. But it's so common that this has to be an external intrusion, the way I see it.
Yeah, because you would never think anything like that voluntarily. I mean, you wouldn't go there. Like the last time I remember it clearly happened to me out here in Arizona. We don't cut the lawns. We don't mow the lawns. We go out with a machete and cut the cactus, you know, and whack the cactus back. So I was out in the backyard with my dog, a beautiful dog. It doesn't belong in the desert. It's a white kind of husky. And here I am cutting the cactus. And then all of a sudden this thought barges into my head, cut its head off. And I'm like, what? I'm shocked. I mean, that I could even have such a thought. It's like, how could you have such a thought? And then I started blaming myself, and I'm like, I knew it wasn't my thought. I even knew this, and still it was upsetting. So yeah, they throw that kind of stuff in. And there was one preacher I was talking to who was standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon, and he had a strong thought come into his head, said, jump. And this guy's one of the most, he's one of the most well-adjusted people I know. So they throw these thoughts into your mind, and they do not come from you. And your regular thoughts, they're either a program playing. So if you're thinking, you're running a program, and that program is based on past programming, including your entire past history. So the way you see the world is depending on all the events that have happened to you in your life, and you're interpreting current events in view of those past events. So, and as long as you're doing that, everything seems stable. You know what's going on, and there's no real surprises. I mean, you're just, but you're running a program. Now you step aside from that program and think, okay, those thoughts are not me. Who am I? Then you become, you are the one who's listening. You are the one who's watching. You're the silence that these meditator guys are going after. You're the awareness. You are just the pure awareness. And where that is directed depends on your history and whether you realize that these entities are out there, because they're going to direct everybody's mind in a negative direction. And look at the state of the planet right now. Look at what's going on. The deep state, the crap that they're doing. The look at the battle you had to break free of them over there with Brexit. They threw everything at you but the friggin' really kitchen sink.
Yeah. Everything was stacked against it.
Yes.
And the state was stacked against it. And the state's organizations, the state's agents in every part of the media. We have NGOs, think tanks, all attacking. And what I have noticed is that this very controlling and negative force is actually omnipresent. It is there all the time.
Yes.
And this is what people have talked about for thousands of years, being invaded by these entities and these basically negative forces. I mean, I like to go into it in great detail and try and find out as much as possible about all this stuff, but I think we've got a very good overview there tonight. And just before we finish this interview, just tell us a bit about the book, and also about, I think we were trying to talk about this ages ago, but I've stayed out of the stream because of the streaming problems. But the sort of hierarchy of voices, and basically how you can really make them go away and get the people who've been affected by them to tell their own voices to leave, which you have done, but also to get into a more positive area. In other words, going into the light. That's a bit of a misunderstood phrase, but the idea that these demonic entities can themselves free themselves from their controllers or whatever's controlling them, or their need to control, and they can actually free themselves. Quite a few things there, but it'd be great if we could get onto that.
Well, that what we've talked about so far is strange, but that gets into the area of the very strange. And for me, once I left the state prison and started working in the private sector, doing psychiatric evaluations in emergency rooms and working for private psychiatric hospitals, but especially in the emergency rooms, they didn't give you much time to get information across. They didn't want you counseling these people. They wanted you to get them out of the ER. It wasn't, they didn't consider it your job to give them useful information as to what they could do about their voices, because as far as they were concerned, the only thing useful was their drugs. And it was either, schedule them to be admitted and get a dose of drugs again, and it's all one big revolving door. These same people were coming through time after time after time. They'd admit them psychiatrically, they'd charge them a fortune, milk their insurance companies for everything they could get out of them. They'd keep them there for as long as they possibly could, and when their insurance would no longer pay, they'd kick them out again with a prescription for these toxic drugs. And that would happen over and over. It's just a big revolving door. Nothing was being cured, nothing. So my challenge in wanting to help these people was, how much information can I get over to them that would be useful to them, that wouldn't get me in trouble? And I could get in trouble real quick with psychiatry in the ERs. And so the most devastating thing that you could get across to a psychiatric patient hearing voices is that these voices are parasites, that they are draining their energy. That's the very last thing these voices want these people to know. And every time I approached giving them that information, soon as I did, the voices went crazy. They just exploded. So I had to figure out ways to kind of shut the voices up so I could reach the patient. Otherwise, they would just blot me out. They would get so loud the patient couldn't hear anything I was saying. So if there's bad forces, they're good forces. And I never went into the prison or the ER or any of this work without asking for divine protection and protection from my guardian angels. And the most powerful of which was Michael. So what I would do is ask Michael to shut up those voices long enough, and then for me to reach the patient. And what I would, thoughts are things. They're things. They're not, that's one thing psychiatry doesn't go into. What are thoughts? Where they come from? How do they operate? They don't even look at that. They go, yeah, schizophrenia is a thought disorder, but they don't even look into, well, okay, what thoughts are disordered and how are they disordered and what disorders them? They completely ignore that. They just drug the patient. They don't ask questions. And when I was in graduate school, when I asked these questions, it was like, who are you, weirdo? They didn't have any answers that I was looking for. So what I would do was when I was trying to reach one of them that I thought could use this information, and I had to be careful about which ones I chose, because it's going to be very volatile when they get this information. I had to kind of judge how well they could control themselves, and I had to do that at the prison too. It's like walking on a razor blade, because the prisoners would come in and they go, my voices are telling me to go stab this guard, and I'm like, if he does it, I'm screwed. The guard he's him and his family, and it causes lots of repercussions. So it's like, can I trust this guy to be able to maintain? And I tell him ahead of time, I'm not going to take any action against you unless you do something or look like you won't be able to control yourself, and you have a strong intention to hurt yourself or others. And if you can't convince me that you're not going to do that, I'm going to take action to have you locked down. I tell them that from the get-go. And then it became hairy, because they'd come in with stuff like, yeah, I'm going to attack this guard, or the voices are telling me to attack this guard. And then I'd have to ferret out, well, what are the probability that this guy would do that? Because if I lock him down and word gets out to the rest of the ones that I'm working with, none of them are going to tell me anything. So I do stuff like, okay, I'm going to have you in every day for a while, or I'm going to have you in twice a day for a while, keep an eye on you. And if it looks like you're losing it, I'm going to have to do something. So thank God that never happened, but it's like walking on the edge of a razor blade sometime. So that doing that was useful when it got to the ER, because it was another different kind of razor blade. Is this guy going to explode and go nuts in the ER? And that happened once or twice, where somebody couldn't stand it anymore, and they barged out of the office, and it was constant, where their voices were telling them to attack me or to kill me. That was just normal operating stuff. It was like it happened almost every time I dealt with one of these guys, where I was telling them what was going on. So what I would do to shut up the voices so I could reach the patient, I would imagine this bright light exploding inside the patient and blasting these things out, and then a big net made of white light dragging across the patient and dragging them out, and then depositing them in this big box of white light with 3-foot thick walls so they couldn't get out. And what I found is that if there were physical symptoms, like if the patient was sweating or nervous or irritable or anxious and couldn't sit still, and those physical symptoms would stop at that time once I visualized these things in that box of white light. But what didn't stop is they could talk through that box of white light. And that surprised me. So then I visualized wrapping, now this sounds insane, but it actually worked. I'd visualize wrapping a roll of duct tape around their mouths over and over again so they couldn't say anything. And then I'd ask the patient, well, okay, what's happening now? So I was constantly getting feedback from the patient, and they'd say, well, they're not talking, but they're grunting. They're going, making noises like you would make if your mouth was with duct tape. And then I'd take that box and I'd hurl it out into outer space for a while, and then the voices would disappear for enough time for me to get this information through to the patient. But there were a number of times where when I started approaching, telling them, the voices would come right back and start blocking. And then I found I could use this against them, where I would ask the patient in the ER, are you hearing the voices now? They say, well, no. So when the last time you heard them? Well, when I was back in the formal ER with the doctor, they were talking to me then. And I said, okay, well, you're going to be hearing them in about 5 minutes, and they're going to be real loud, and this is what they're going to tell you. They're going to say, one is they're going to tell you that I'm crazy, I'm stupid, not to listen to anything I have to say, that I'm a lunatic. If you stay with that, if you stay in here and you don't leave, they're going to tell you to get up and leave the office or try to escape the ER. And I said, if you don't do that, they're going to tell you to attack me, or they're going to tell you to kill me. And what was strange is that came on like clockwork. Is in 5 minutes after I went to tell them that these voices were parasites, they exploded on the scene. They told that just in the same order that I told the patient these things would do. They're going to tell you that I'm crazy, I'm stupid. They're going to tell you to escape the ER. They're going to tell you that would roll off. It was like the voices could not stop it. It was strange. It was like they were programmed to do this, and they couldn't alter that response. And that struck me as very odd. Because somebody said to you, hey, Mark, you're going to be dancing on your head in 5 minutes. You're going to go, screw you, I am not. But they couldn't do that. That response rolled off just like every single time after time. For scores of times, this happened. And once they saw that, then there was no, they were convinced that I knew something about these voices that they didn't. And then they would listen, irrespective of what the voices said or did. So they were able to leave the ER with Sherry's program. They're liars. Everything they tell you is virtually a lie. And I made the mistake one time of thinking that it was everything they said was a lie. And this was in the ER. And I told the patient that, and the voices came through the patient and said, oh, yeah, well, I'm telling him that that wall is green. So the patient said, the voices just told me that wall is green, and said, is that a lie? I said, no, I guess not. The wall's green. Well, there you go. Everything we say isn't a lie. And I went to Sherry and I said, what do you think of this? And she goes, no, it's not everything. It's every negative thing they say about the patient or anybody else that in the patient's life. So that's one thing. Now, when I was in the prison, I had time to work with these things. And I was actually speaking with the voices. There was a long period of time where I was doing that. Now, Wilson Van Dusen, it's mentioned in our book how he approached this. And he would try to make friends with them. And what we found was that some of the voices told me that they were told that they had no light in them, and that if they didn't follow the orders of their superiors to destroy this individual, that they would cease to exist. And they believed that. Now, here's another strange thing. Everything's made of light. So I would take this voice and I said, okay. and I'd have the inmate relax, and I'd say, okay, let's take a trip and go down and see if there's no light. So I'd imagine us disappearing down looking for this light, and eventually it would show up. And I'd ask the voice, I said, do you see the light yet? No, I don't see any light. Okay, let's go deeper. All right, you see it yet? No, I don't see it. Okay, let's go further. And so, okay, you see it yet? And they go, well, yeah, I see it. I see a dim orange light. I said, okay, let's go toward it. He goes, no, I've been told that that light is dangerous. I said, don't worry about it. It's okay. And so we'd approach the light, and I'd say, I thought you were told that you didn't have any light. This is your light. This is in you, inside the voice. And they would get furious. They'd say, I was lied to. I have light. They can't make me disappear. And I said, yeah, you were lied to. And they would be absolutely furious. And then I said, okay, let's go back and visit the patient. Okay. And I said, let's go look at their light. And then we'd go, and I'd say, okay, here's their light. And I said, stick your arm in there. And they go, no, it'll burn me. I told the light is poisonous, it'll burn me. I said, no, it's not going to hurt you. Stick your arm in there. They'd stick their arm in there, and there would be no harm. There was one case where the guy said, the voice said, well, it burned me. And I said, no, it didn't. And I said, stick it in again. It's not hurting you. So it did. And I said, okay, enter the light. And they were afraid because they were told that the light would kill them. And they once they're standing in the light, I said, oh, okay, now, do you have any deceased friends or relatives that you can call who you trust? And they go, yeah, I do. I said, okay, call them now. And they call Aunt Joni or whoever. And then that person would show up. And I said, do you trust Aunt Joni? And they go, well, yeah. And I said, well, go with her into the light. And they go, oh, no, I don't know about that. I said, well, you've already broken several of the laws that the dark side has laid upon you. You've explored the light. You found that you have light in you. You found out that they were liars. You're talking to me, which you're not supposed to be doing. You've exposed information to me that you weren't supposed to expose. You better go with her, because you know what's going to happen to you if you go back to where you were. And once they disappear and Aunt Joni hauls them off, that voice is gone. It's gone. Now there's others, but that one is gone. Yeah. And sometimes, what was even stranger, sometimes it wasn't a person, it was an animal. Like one time it was a horse, another time it was a dog that shows up to lead these people into the light, or whatever these things are. Then there was one time where I did that, and the one voice that was really plaguing the guy, we got rid of two of them, and I thought they were free, because the person said, I'm hearing two voices. We got rid of two voices. They were hearing silence, and then all of a sudden I felt like I was being attacked. I mean, I got this icky electrical feeling all over the place. And I asked the patient, I said, where'd that one come from? What's happening? And they turned around, they said, well, that's their superior. And he was pissed off that I got rid of these other two. And that one was a little harder to get rid of. It left, but it came back. So it wasn't about to walk into the light. But yeah, this is, like the Bible says, this is not a physical war. This is a spiritual war. And these are just kind of snapshots of the battleground. So the book Sherry and I are talking about kind of covers all this stuff. And there's so many schizophrenic families and patients that don't know what's going on. They have no idea. And once they read this stuff, at least they understand what it is. And then toward the end, we give them some things they can do free of charge to get rid of these voices that will actually cure the patient if they stick with it, if they're consistently use it. And it doesn't cost anything. They don't have to take toxic meds forever. I mean, they're not powerless like psychiatry is telling them. They can take a stand against these voices and fight for their lives. And it is a fight. It's a struggle. but we can give them the tools to do this, and it costs nothing. Big pharma and psychiatry ain't gonna like this, but that's the truth. That's what's happening. They have no answers. No. They're way off base. They've been crawling up the wrong tree for decades, for centuries, and they're still insisting that they know something. They know crap. They know absolute crap. Nothing.
I think this is a general thing throughout what we go into, Jerry, because when we start taking apart what is known and what is not known, it doesn't matter whether you're dealing with this coronavirus and what that's really about, or whether it's the climate change agenda, or whether it's the whole kind of way society's been re-engineered, and that basically liars have been put into every part of public office. And a lot of these people are pretty sociopathic and psychopathic. So you're really up against negative forces all the time. And I think that's where you're saying that it's a spiritual battle comes in. So I think this is quite misunderstood with people, in that it actually is about having this inner integrity to fight this stuff. I think that's a very important thing, because
you're right
that
on.
Inner integrity gives you so much strength. And I've tried to stay out of the conversation tonight because the streaming problems, and what you're saying is so fascinating. I'm always fascinated by what you've got to say. And I think you've laid it out very well there, given some good examples. And we're going to wrap this up in a minute, but we can go into certain areas of what we've talked about. Maybe if I go back into chat for a minute, there was just a few people who said things that I thought were very interesting, which I would like to just bring up.
Okay.
But first of all, there's a chap called Greg Silverado, and Greg's been listening to our show for ages, and he puts a lot of humorous comments, and he said, I'm sure I know Jerry. And he said, where's Jerry from? And I said, I think he's from Tucson. And Greg's from Tucson. He said he's met you. So that's Greg from Tucson who knows you, and he's in chat tonight. And I'm just going back through what we've got in here. The idea of drugs opening up these gateways to these voices, we didn't quite get into that, but I mean, you did say that the main gateway is amphetamine, particularly methamphetamine. But what about these strong hybrid versions of cannabis? Because there's a big debate on this, and I think it's quite important, because my personal belief and my experience is that cannabis, especially these hybrid strains of cannabis like skunk, are an absolute gateway to this stuff. What do you think on all that?
Well, the only experience I've had with that was years ago, when the marijuana wasn't as strong as it is today. And the voices would steer patients away from using marijuana because it calmed them down, and they didn't want them calmed down. They wanted them hyped up. They wanted them anxious and fretting. Now, there were some cases where the person was on the brink. They were very unstable, and marijuana threw them over. But for the most part, regular marijuana back in my day would calm them down, and the voices didn't like them using it. Now, as far as the strong stuff today, I don't know. I know several people who use that stuff, and they're not psychotic, but I don't know any psychotics who use it now, today. But I can guarantee you that amphetamine, Ritalin, Adderall, all those things open up the door. And I talked to scores of prisoners who were diagnosed ADHD, and they were given Adderall. And they couldn't stay on the dose they were supposed to stay on. They kept increasing it until they moved to meth on the streets. And I'd ask them, well, why? Why'd you do that? You were feeling as good as you ever have, and then you just kept jacking it up. What's with that? And they go, I don't know. I don't know why I did that. So it's a very dangerous drug. The other thing we were talking about earlier is these EVP things, where these ghost listening devices. I'm getting more and more email from people that are saying, hey, I was listening to the EVP thing, and these voices were coming through on my ghost listening device. And then one day they entered the person, and they were hearing them in their own heads, and they couldn't get rid of them. So there were several of them came on. I got several emails saying that these devices and tuning into the spiritual world in that manner can be dangerous. And of course, we all know the Ouija boards have been dangerous for years. Tons of people went
Yeah, I
psychotic.
can actually quantify that. Yeah, I mean, years ago I had experiences with all that stuff, which is why I've now got this overview of it and the different levels of power that these entities have. And I think it is helpful to try and categorize them, because when you get these highly demonic entities, basically demons, these are extremely powerful. The things that people get possessed with or that seem to invade them can be actually quite weak but very persistent. And the thing that they all have in common is that it's all about deception. As far as I've experienced, it's all about deception or putting you into fear and negativity. And I think you've covered that very well.
Yes, deception and control, and all to generate negative emotional energy. So you look at how much negative emotion and fear is being generated by this Ebola crap, or this coronavirus stuff. I mean, look at the world is in fear over bull crap. The mainstream media are just pushing it, and everybody's terrified. It's a hog's trough right now. People are starting to wake up. They're starting to wake up. Britain woke up and broke away from the EU, and U.S. is waking up, and Trump is really pounding. I mean, he's been under constant attack from these things. But you look at people like Merkel and Macron. I mean, they are not going to give way. They're just not going to give way. With their dying breath, they're going to keep pushing and pushing and pushing for control and manipulation of the people.
Yeah, well, these are agents of these forces.
Yes,
and
they
these
are.
forces are really about control. So when it comes down to it, I mean, I've gone into this in great detail over the years, the Agenda 2030 plans and this coronavirus, especially last Sunday, we went into it, and it's called UK Mind Virus. And I've done 2 shows which have that in the title, but it is a mind virus that is being unleashed on the public. So in other words, they're being possessed by this idea that they're going to catch something that could kill them. And in actual fact, it's based on nothing. When I looked into it, and I've got even more information on it now, it was all dreamt up by the World Economic Forum and the World Health Organization. They can't even quantify this virus. But this is another point, because I don't think it matters whether it's a mind virus or a virus which is invading the body, which has physical symptoms. They're all negative. And I think this is another important point, that illness is pretty negative. You feel pretty negative when you're ill. I mean, I've had something for the past week or so, and it's been on and off. But you can actually feel yourself becoming negative with illness. And that is a really bad thing. And when it starts to wear off, you get almost a euphoria. So I think this stuff is worth being consciously aware of all the time. I mean, I don't want to generalize too much here, but I think you've given a really good overview there for tonight. And we'll definitely carry this on. We've done several shows with Jerry. If you look in the archive, if you look up Are Demons Real? And there's stuff about out-of-body experiences, psychic attacks and paranormal, all in the back catalogue of Wonders in the World, which for new listeners and viewers, they may not be aware of these shows, and they're there in the back catalogue, and very interesting stuff too. So I'm going to wrap this up now, Jerry, but where can people buy the book? It's called An Amazing Journey into the Psychotic Mind.
Well, I don't know if you can see this or not.
Yeah, I can see it. Okay.
So you can get it on Amazon, or you can go to jerrymarzinsky.com and order it there. It's on Lulu, and it's also from Amazon, and it'll cover this material pretty well. It took us a couple of years to get this out, but we finally did it. People they need to be aware of this. I mean, it has to get out, and it's not going to be carried by the mainstream media at all. And I'm sure psychiatry and the medical people are going to suppress this when it starts getting out too far. But people are waking up, and this is the time to do it, and this is a wake-up call. Your mind is under constant attack. Remember, every negative thought you have about yourself or anybody else, it's not your thought. It doesn't belong to you. And the thoughts who you think are you, the talk that runs in your mind all the time, that voice that you're constantly listening to, is not who you are either. You're the person listening to it. And you have to take control of making the decisions, what you're going to focus your attention on. Because where you focus your attention is where you give your energy. And right now, everybody's focused on negativity. So these things they've got a feeding trough going on right now.
It's quite interesting, actually, Jerry, that a lot of this stuff, which is used for psychologically control the public, is about their greed, their emotions, and basically breeding narcissism within the individual, because these are all disempowering states. And I find this fascinating, the whole way that society's engineered. And the engineering is on a very, very simplistic level now. It's very simplistic, like this coronavirus. It's so simplistic. You've actually got Imperial College giving our government and your government in America a computer model to follow. In other words, we predict this amount of people are going to die. Yeah. Well, there you go. There's your fear porn. And right. Boris Johnson saying that we're going to follow the computer models. I mean, even he looked surprised when he was saying it, because I think that anybody can see now that this is being orchestrated. And then you've got the martial law aspect. They're closing all the pubs down. They're going to try and basically take everything that affects the livelihood of people away. So this is an infrastructure grab, and this is really big if they get away with it. They're talking about keeping kids off school, because that's the Chinese model is now being rolled out there on the back of what happened in Wuhan with this virus. They brought in these heat sensitive cameras, and to basically see if anybody had a temperature and had a virus. And they used it to bring in more cameras, but also they used it to try out this thing called Google School, which is basically where children plug into the Internet of Things and have virtual reality experiences. So then they've got the child from the cradle, basically, to the grave. That's it. They start the education and the indoctrination there. But that's another story I'm going to go into. And do look at our last show on Windows on the World, because we go into exactly what this virus is about and the mind virus that accompanies it. So thanks a lot, Jerry. And we'll have a chat in the very near future, and I'll catch up with what you're doing. And yes, do buy the book. It's great. I can recommend it. It's a very easy read, and it's fascinating, and it gives case studies, and it gives some very good advice. So thanks a lot, Jerry.
All right. And you might want to consider having Sherry on later because she's the other part of the picture.
Yes.
Yeah, she's been there.
Because of the streaming tonight, yes. I'm actually in the middle of nowhere at the moment, so I'm streaming from a mobile device, and I think we've got away with it. It seems to be okay now. And yeah, Windows towers does tend to move around a bit these days, but it's because I'm doing interesting work. So please do support us. Support us through Patreon or PayPal. Does help. It helps us get around the country and do talks and bring information to you. And I'm working on this all the time. And it's great because we're really decoding this stuff now. And the good news is that it's quite easy to explain once you've decoded it. So we're going to keep doing that. So thanks a lot, Jerry.
You're doing great work. Keep it up.
Thanks, Jerry. I'll definitely be in touch very soon. And thanks for coming on.
Okie dokie.
That's it. Good night, everybody. Thanks a lot.